Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, board members and guests. Am I on? Yeah. And guests to the Wednesday, January 27th, 2021 meeting of the South Placer Regional Transportation Authority. We are conducting this meeting via teleconference under Executive Order N2920, approved by Governor Newsom on March 17, 2020. We appreciate your participation and patience with this technology. A recording of this meeting will be posted to our website after the meeting. Under public comment, there will be multiple opportunities throughout this meeting for public comment. When I open an item up for public comment, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you would like to make a public comment on this item. If you are joining the webinar on your computer, you can also do so by clicking the raise hand button on the middle bottom of the Zoom webinar window. If you are joining over the phone, you can do so by pressing *9. SPRTA staff will then call out individuals who have raised their hand, giving them permission to speak one by one. When you are called, please state your full name and city of residence. You will then have a maximum of 3 minutes to provide your public comment, and SPRTA staff will notify you when your 3 minutes are up. If you experience technical difficulties and are unable to provide your public comment, please email your comment to Sophie Sobel, our clerk at ssabol@pctpa.net. Under board action, because this meeting is being conducted via teleconference, all votes will be roll call votes. Board members, we ask that you state your name prior to making a motion or seconding a motion for the record. Once an item has been moved and seconded, I will request the clerk to call the roll to vote. And I appreciate the large print, so we thank you very much. So if you'll please stand and join me for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, if the clerk would be kind enough to call the roll.
Broadway.
Here.
Holmes.
Yes, I'm here.
Howdeshelt.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Got full house.
All righty. We will now move to item C, approval of action minutes, December 2nd, 2020.
Joyner moves approval. Broadway second.
Joyner moves, Broadway seconds. Oh, the clerk, please call the roll.
Broadway.
Yes.
Holmes.
Abstain?
Howdeshelt.
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Now's the time to move to item D, agenda review. Is there anything on the agenda that needs to be reviewed before we move forward?
Mr. Chair, staff has no changes recommended to the agenda as presented.
Okay, now is the time for public comment on any item that's not on the agenda. Is there anyone from the public that wishes to make a comment?
I'll also add that we'll entertain any public requests for changes to the agenda at this time.
Okay, yeah.
I am seeing no public comment at this time, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we now move to item F, Regional Transportation and Air Quality Mitigation Fee Allocation Request for Interstate 80 Rockland Road Interchange. Mr. Luke McNeil-Caird.
Thank you, Chair Holmes, members of the board. Delighted to present one of my last two items here. So the SPRTA Tier 1 program includes $10 million for the Interstate 80 Rockland Road Interchange. And the city of Rockland has requested an allocation of $2.5 million to complete the environmental and design of the interchange, which is really going to allow the city to go after state and federal funding. We found that, once you complete the pre-construction, you become much more successful in pursuing the construction funding. The remaining SPRTA fee would be available for a future allocation request, and the SPRTA Technical Advisory Committee has concurred with this item. And of course, this is a important regional project that supports economic development in the city of Rockland and also Sierra Community College. And with that, I'll turn it back to the chair.
All righty. Any questions, comments for Mr. Luke McNeil-Cannard?
No questions.
Anybody from the public wishes to make a comment?
Mr. Chair, there's no public comment at this time.
All righty, then the chair will entertain a motion.
Broadway make a motion to approve.
Joiner seconds.
Broadway moves the motion, Joyner seconds. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Broadway,
Yes.
Holmes,
Yes.
Haudashelt,
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Now we'll move to item G, mini workshop on SPRTA travel demand model and tier 1 and tier 2 impact fee update. Mr. Hoyt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kathleen, is Dawn Hubbard been presented to presenter?
Oh, good.
Promoted Mr. Hubbard. Mr. Hubbard, can you hear us? He's on mute. I've asked him to unmute.
Okay. Well, he
unmuted.
is perfect. Great. Well, he now that Dawn Hubbard from WSP is on, we'll go ahead and present introduction on this. So just want to thank everyone for the time this morning. The SPRTA Model and Fee Update Program is something that's a few months in the works now, and that you'll be hearing from us over the course of the next almost 2 years on. The SPRTA Model and Fee Update Program is a significant effort and something that really hasn't been overhauled to this extent in a number of years. We've gone through revisions over the past several years, but not a major overhaul such as we're doing today. So we want to set the groundwork and the schedule for what we're doing over the next 2 years and highlight some of the items that we'll be coming back to you for in the future. Next slide. So the travel demand model and impact fee program really has three main components. It's updating the travel demand model, which is a tool that we'll use. But that tool is the primary tool to use for the SPRTA fee nexus study update, which needs to follow certain state regulatory requirements and legal requirements to be effective and to minimize the chance of litigation. And we also want to touch on how we're going to connect the various stakeholders in the public on this project. And while this is somewhat of a technical approach, this does have a very strong connection to the overall funding strategy for transportation improvements in South Placer County. So this may seem, this will take a different approach than maybe we've had in the past, but we really want to try to show how the SPRTA fee programs and funding in South Placer County can deliver our future transportation needs. And then we'll highlight an overall schedule and then wrap up with any questions and answers. Next slide, please. So I'll handle the background, and then towards the end of this, I'm going to turn it over to Donald Hubbard from WSP. They're the consultant that we selected back in September of 2020, and they'll be helping us out through all the technical exercises over the course of the next 2 years. So SPRTA was actually conceptualized back in 2000. And at this point in time is when we really started, from what I understand, to look at funding needs and future transportation improvements in the South Placer area. You know, looking at how are we going to build the Lincoln bypass? How are we going to widen 65? How are we going to do a number of improvements that we know we'll need in the future? And so this regional fee program came about. It was formalized with the Joint Powers Authority in 2002, and it implemented a nexus-based regional impact fee program in the cities of Lincoln, Roseville, Rockland, and the unincorporated portions of Placer County. The Tier 2 program came on later in 2009, and this was a regional fee supplement that will be incorporated into development agreements in areas that were not at that point in time part of Tier 1 And those funds will go towards the fully funding construction for Placer Parkway. Next slide, please. The projects that are incorporated within the Tier 1 and Tier 2 regional fee programs really started off with only 5 projects. That was the Placer Parkway, Sierra College Boulevard, Lincoln Bypass, Douglas Boulevard, interchange and improvements, and various transit improvement projects. As the program evolved over the years and matured, additional projects were incorporated as the future deficiencies were identified and the needs were solidified. So in 2007, there were 3 projects were added. And then again in 2014, 3 additional projects were added. And so those are the various projects that the SPRTA Tier 1 and Tier 2 programs fund to date. Next slide, please. Within just the Tier 1 program, you can see how much funding Tier 1 program would allocate to those projects. From the beginning, it was conceptualized as $124 million in regional fees that would go towards those identified projects. And during the various updates, those costs were increased because maybe we've added projects, project scopes have changed. We also had to account for inflationary costs as we move forward in the program. And now to date, it's $195 million within the Tier 1 program that will fund just over $1.2 billion worth of projects. Next slide, please. Those fees come from approximately 10 districts within the South Placer area as shown on your screen. The fees are determined using the travel demand model to account for the types of development, the travel patterns associated within each of these districts. A dwelling unit equivalent is used to level out the variability between differences in travel patterns between residential projects, commercial projects, and industrial. The Tier 2 fees are built into development agreements and is a flat fee associated with all those projects. Next slide. So why are we bringing up a 2-year overhaul to our travel demand model and regional impact fee program? There's several reasons why we're doing this. Approvals with major significant specific plans within South Placer have occurred since our last update in 2014. The Sunset Area Plan, Omarosa Ranch specific plan, to name a few, are triggering this. Also, the age of our travel demand model dates back, the bones of it, the structure of the model, dates back to probably the early 2000s. And while we've updated it over time, we've updated it for land uses within Placer, but not outside of Placer. So it's timely to update that. And it's generally required that our Nexus studies are updated every 5 years. So we're on point for that. And as I mentioned earlier, stakeholder engagement is going to be a critical component. We want to make sure that everyone from city staff to the building community and others understand how this fee program is an integral part with the South Placer funding strategy to deliver projects that we need. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Donald Hubbard from WSP. He's a consultant, represents WSP, the consultant firm that we selected back in September. He's going to go through the process of the update and pose some of the policy questions that we'll be coming back to the board with later this year. And then I'll wrap up towards the end with the schedule and the outreach.
Thanks, Aaron. So I'm going to start by discussing the updated the Placer County model, the SPRTA model, which will then be used for the next component, which is the Nexus study. So the first question is, why update the model? And the reason is that the travel demand model is the main analytical tool that's used in the Nexus study. So if the model doesn't accurately reflect current traffic conditions, then the Nexus study that's based on it, could be vulnerable to legal challenge. So we look at your existing model. It's based on an old version of SACOG's model and several versions ago. Its land use and road assumptions date from 2014 and are no longer valid because so much has happened in Placer County since then, as Aaron was saying. In addition, we spoke with the staff of the member agencies, and they said that they would like a model that could do a new type of analysis that's required under SB 743. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we're going to create a model that's useful for a number of things. Besides the Nexus study, the model will be useful for EIRs going forward, including, as I said, the new VMT requirements. It'll also be useful for the planning and design studies that are the day-to-day work of a lot of the member agencies, their staff. And we're trying to make a tool that's consistent so that everybody doing traffic studies in Placer County will be using the same assumptions. So a couple of months ago, while we were developing our approach, we spoke with the staff of the different member agencies and asked them what features would they like to see in the new model. And what they told us is they'd like a lot of detail in Placer County so that they can do their traffic studies, specifically a lot more detail in Placer County than is in the SACOG model. They want the geographic coverage to move eastward, at least as far as SR20. They'd like a short run time, so a few hours at most, not days like the regional model takes, and they'd like it to be user-friendly. And so those are our design parameters. Next slide, please. So what'll be different about the new model? Well, for one thing, it's going to extend eastward to include Auburn, Loomis, and the I-80 corridor up to Immigrant Gap. And in addition, the transportation network will be updated to include the latest RTP, and the land uses will be updated to be consistent with the latest sustainable community strategy. And that's a key feature because CEQA allows you to base your EIR assumptions on an adopted plan. So if you use this model for an EIR, then the legal validity of the assumptions are already baked into the model. It'll already be set up for you, which should make traffic studies a lot easier. Plus it will have an entirely new component designed to meet the requirements of SB 743. Next slide, please. So let me explain a little bit about that. As you may be aware, SB 743 completely changes the way traffic impacts are measured under CEQA. For the last 50 years, traffic impacts have been measured using what's called level of service. More recently, environmentalists and academics have convinced the state government that trying to fix level of service resulted in an ever-expanding road network, which caused environmental problems. So in 2013, the state enacted a law to say that you had to change, you could no longer use level of service. You need a new way to measure impacts, and that's vehicle miles of travel, or VMT. This law went into effect on July 1st, statewide, on July 1st, 2020. So now we need a model that calculates the effect that a proposed project might have on statewide VMT. And as everyone on this call knows, people in Placer County drive to a lot of places outside the county, which means that the model that we have has to expand in geographic scope. So what you see here in this figure is some census information about where people living in the city of Lincoln work. And the table above summarizes this data. As you can see, only 29% work within 10 miles of their home. So it's mainly in Placer County. There's another 35% that travel between 10 and 25 miles away, mostly in Sacramento County. And finally, there's 28% that are going more than 50 miles one way to their jobs. So because of the new need to analyze VMT, and you can't just look at nearby intersections anymore. Now your traffic studies are going to have to account for very long trips. And we have a technique for doing that using what's called big data. Next slide, please. In terms of where we are in developing the model, this flow chart shows all the steps to develop the base year model. The blue steps have to do with land uses, the red steps with developing the network files, the green steps the program, and then the gray steps are all where we put everything together and calibrate and adjust. And the red outline shows what we're doing at the moment. So we're putting together the updated land use file and including updating the other parts of the SACOG network. We're also processing big data that we were able to get from SACOG. They had a program called Replica that was available until December 31st. We downloaded all that, as well as looking to use the streetlight data that I understand is included in the SPRTA, the budget amendment that's later in this agenda. And this information is needed to give us the origin and destination data that we need for the SB 743 component. And we're also at the same time, we're updating the road network file. Next slide, please. We asked member agencies to help by providing some of the data that we need as inputs for the model, and I'm happy to report the response has been great. We've already got the intersection counts, the parcel databases, the road shape files, and information about pending projects. So there's just a few odds and ends left to collect. So great cooperation on that. Next slide, please. So that's the development of the model. Once the model is complete, the very first application is going to be the SPRTA Nexus update. Because as you know, as Aaron said, state law requires impact fees to be updated periodically to make sure that the land use assumptions, project costs, and other factors remain accurate. Next slide, please. Nexus studies are a bit different from other types of traffic studies. I do both, and they're really quite different animals. In some way, they're more like doing income tax returns in that there are a lot of calculations set in a complicated legal framework, and you follow a logical process that leads to a numerical result. And just like income taxes, it's important to understand and follow the rules. Plus, of course, collecting any type of fee can be contentious. For example, I've worked on nexus studies where that are multi-jurisdictional, like this one, where one city wants to raise the fees and do more projects while its neighbor wants to find a way to cut the fees. So because there are different opinions on this, it's helpful to do a lot of outreach and consensus building to show that the process is being done fairly and that everyone's point of view is being considered. Next slide, please. So the Mitigation Fee Act and other applicable state laws have a number of specific legal requirements that some of which are listed here. I'm not going to go into them, but trust me, we've done this many times before and understand the requirements inside and out. The short version is that we will need to identify the existing transportation deficiencies, plus any new deficiencies that will occur in the future as the county keeps growing, and then we're going to use that information to determine the fair share of new development. So it's the model that's going to give us that information about the deficiencies and who would be using who would be causing the deficiencies. All of this needs to be thoroughly documented to demonstrate that all the legal requirements have been met. Next slide, please. We always make it very easy for reviewers, members of the public, policymakers, to know that the requirements have indeed been met by including a section on each and every legal requirement and showing how it's been satisfied by our analysis. Next slide, please. So the Mitigation Fee Act sets a framework, but within that framework, agencies have a fair amount of discretion to make policy choices. So later this year, once the model is near completion, I'll be coming back to you, the board, with a number of policy options, at which time you'll have an option to either continue what you're doing with the current system or perhaps go in a different direction. And here's just for a few examples of what I mean by policy options. The law allows you to charge different fees for different areas like SPRTA Tier 1 does, or have a uniform fee like Tier 2. Both those are perfectly legitimate. Fees are based on deficiencies, but deficiencies could be measured on the basis of daily conditions or on peak hour conditions. And which one you choose will have a big effect on the fees. Because if you choose peak hour, the fees are going to fall more heavily on office and industrial development, while if you use daily, it's going to fall more heavily on retail. Plus, of course, every trip has two ends. So a trip between a home and a business, or say an office and a home to an office or a store, could be attributed to the business or to the home or split 50-50. And clearly that's going to have a major impact on who pays the fees, all of which are allowable under the Mitigation Fee Act. So as I said, when the model is nearing completion, we'll be coming back to the board to discuss these policy options. We'll go over the advantages and the effects of each one. And again, the law allows you some flexibility in choosing what you want to do to tailor the policies to the fees and to the goals of the program. I will say in advance, though, that part of the reason for having an impact fee program in the first place is to give the development community a stable backdrop to make long-term decisions. So they want to know what they'll be charged, what sort of infrastructure improvements they can expect, and so forth. So you don't want to change things just to change them. But if there's a strong reason, the law says every 5 years you go over this to give you the opportunity to make those mid-course corrections. Next slide, please. PCTPA staff believe it would be beneficial to have a solid program of outreach to gain support for the program. And I'll turn it back to Aaron for this.
Great, thank you, Don. And I see a chat that was in here, and we'll address that question in a few minutes. So next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, public outreach on this will be more than you would expect for a typical model and fee update. We are doing a lot of work within the South Placer area on the funding strategy, or we will be doing that in the future. And we want to make sure that these two very similar topics don't get misconstrued. We want stakeholders, the builders, the public, to understand the opportunities and constraints that the Mitigation Fee Act imposes on the developers and new development. What can we ask the developers to fund, and what do we as residents have to fund separately? We also want to make sure that the builders, the chambers of commerce, other interested stakeholders who follow development in Placer County have a place at the table to understand the process, that they see that it is visible, and hopefully that we work through some of the differences we may have before we get to the end line or the end goal. We also want to give the development community, as Don mentioned earlier, a notice that fees may change. You know, depends on whether additional projects get added, project scopes change. With the addition of new specific plan areas, these fees have the possibility to change, and we want to make that clear up front. Next slide. In order to implement our engagement process, there's a number of things that we have planned. We have 4 quarterly board workshops. This is the first of these. This is more of an overview, but we intend, as we come back, to talk more about the different policy options Don mentioned about the fees, how the model works, what is the current traffic conditions. You know, if we have residents within South Placer, are they using I-80 to get to down Sacramento? Are they using Baseline more, or Placer Parkway? So those are some of the differences through the big data that we will be purchasing and obtaining. We'll be able to tell. That will influence future travel trends. We also will have 3 stakeholder workshops. The first of those is currently being planned for mid-February, where we're going to invite the chambers of commerce, various builders, property owners within the South Placer area, and jurisdictional staff to walk through some of the process and potential changes that may come from this update process. And we also will be providing monthly updates for the board and the stakeholders through email blasts. So the first of those is scheduled to go out later this week. The board members and electeds will receive one type of an update that provides a very kind of focused effort of staff and the consultant team, while the other that's going to the stakeholders will be a little more high level on the work that we are doing. And we also plan in the future to do a virtual community workshop that will bring people to a setting just like this and allow us to talk through the project itself. So if we go to the next slide, we will see when those are planned for. So currently we're in January. We're doing our first, we're working on our first stakeholder update that I mentioned will be emailed out later this week. And today is the first board workshop. In February, we're going to actually have that stakeholder workshop with the builders, various community members from the environmental groups in Placer, jurisdictional staff. And later that month in February, we'll be sending out a second update. That second update will talk about how traffic influences and affects development, impacts our daily lives within Placer County. Then there will be a little bit of a lull in March. And as we reach April, we'll be gearing up to release an informational video on traffic in Placer County, how it works, what our future transportation options look like, what we may need for the future. And that will be coordinated with an online virtual workshop and a survey. Then in May, we'll come back with our third update. This will be, again, the email update that talks about the process to date, where we're going, and our next steps. And then in June, we'll come back with an update of where we are with the travel demand model. So in this meeting, we're anticipating being able to talk about current traffic conditions. I know we all know that 65 is congested, but we hope through the use of big data to identify where a lot of the travel is going to, how much travel from our residents is staying within Placer County, how much is it going external, what routes are they using. So we hope to be able to use our big data to highlight what's going on in June with the travel demand model. As we come back to you with future updates, the schedule will evolve, and we'll always continue to have a 6-month outlook for you so you know where we're going with our next steps. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Dawn to wrap up just with the overall schedule for the project over the course of the next 2 years, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to any questions that there may be.
Thanks, Aaron. Next slide, please. So in terms of the overall schedule, we started the modeling work late last year and expect the model to be fully operational by summer. We'll be developing some documentation and a user's guide and probably do some training so that the agency staff member, before the model is finished, though, there are things we can do to start the Nexus study, things like updating project costs and that sort of thing. So we will be starting the Nexus study about May. I expect to come back to the board in June to discuss the policy options. It won't necessarily be decided at that point, but to get people thinking and to consider whether or not you'd like to make changes or not. And we'll come back, depending on what the policy options are selected, we'll be coming back in around March of 2022 with draft fees, at which point you can take a look again and decide whether or not any further mid-course corrections are required. The Nexus study should be done by the end of June 2022. In terms of outreach, Aaron has already gone over the next 6 months. We do expect the outreach to intensify once we get into the Nexus study, because there's just a lot more that's of interest to stakeholders in the Nexus study than in the developing of the model, which is more technical. And with that, I think we're finished this. Next.
And Mr. Chair, there was a question that was submitted via the chat. And I don't know if you want to proceed with us answering that question, or Mr. Chair, if you want to open up to other members to.
Oh, go ahead.
Go
ahead, Aaron.
Okay. So the question was submitted: where does the ITE, which Institute for Traffic Engineers, trip generation rates figure into the process? I'll answer that kind of briefly. And if there's further detail needed, I'll ask Dawn to go into that. But the ITE trip generation rates are what will be used to identify the number of trips homes or businesses would generate through the process. So as we build our travel demand model, we're going to have the various land uses plugged in, and trip generation rates are what's going to help us understand how much travel, typically what time of day does that travel occur, and those trips will then be used to calculate the fees associated with that development. One thing also to mention, we are going through a situation where travel is not typical. I mentioned earlier during the PCTBA board meeting that our overall vehicle miles traveled have dipped, 50% since the start of March 2020. And so what we are doing is trying to utilize 2019 data on travel patterns, assuming that we're going to get back to normal at some point in time. And we are already within 10% of, somewhat normal. So we are using ground truth data that we will have available, and we'll be utilizing these ITE trip rates to figure out the number of trips associated with various developments to calculate the fees.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I might ask, Aaron, what triggered that question on my part was when you have a home to a business trip, where to assign that. And I assume, I remember back in the day, with respect to fast food, that the ITE could get very precise between whether that's a pizza trip or a Chick-fil-A trip. And so I was thinking that might be might help delineate whether that trip gets assigned from a home or a business. But that was kind of the focus of my question.
Yeah, and I think certain situations, when we're doing, individual traffic studies, we have that level of specificity. When we're talking about, maybe future land uses, we may not have the specificity to differentiate, how much traffic Chick-fil-A is generating. We know they generate a lot of traffic and a lot of nuggets. But what we do intend to do is work with the local jurisdictions to understand some of the projects. I think one big example here that I could try to illustrate is warehousing. We do have some warehousing type uses within the industrial corridor and in I-80. And some of those uses may operate differently than they do in other jurisdictions. So for example, we could have, Amazon warehouse that may generate a lot of traffic to and from it, but where we may have another warehouse where it's just production planning or production of goods, and then those all go out on one truck a day. But the square footage itself could be very similar. So those are some of the details we will need to work out and consult, with the local staff and then bring back. So that's, I think, a question that we'll have more answer to when we get into this and that we can bring back to this board.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just follow up.
Sure.
So, I know near me, when you raise industrial quarter, there are also some other uses in those industrial quarters. And I think of, I think of some churches in those areas. So will we be able to, as we're modeling, distinguish out if that trip is going to, a church versus going to pick it up from not Herman Miller? Gosh, I'm dating myself now. Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
So I guess for that specific example, I'm going to maybe ask Dawn to weigh in here. For the specific example of a church, those are going to be more Sunday trips. Although some of our large churches in the 65 corridor do operate schools, and they do have events, that occur during the week. What we're focusing on, though, primarily is kind of a typical weekday, a Monday through Friday type of event and traffic that'll be generated through there. But Dawn, do you have anything to help add some clarity to that question?
Sure thing. There's two different issues here. One is the question of how many land use categories you're going to have for the SPRTA and how they're going to be represented in the model. And so that's one of the things that we are discussing with the member agencies, what sort of parcel database they've got, how their land uses are defined. Ideally, within a model, you would have what's called public and quasi-public, including things like churches and government buildings and other things, and you'd have those in two classes. One would be the type that generates a lot of traffic, say a DMV branch or something, or a church, and one that generates a lot less traffic, say a utility or something like that. And so it gets into what land use classifications we want to have represented in the model, and that's in fact a policy question. Because as Aaron was saying, when you do a tilt-up warehouse, it could be a fulfillment center that generates a lot of trips, or it could end up being used for assembly of product and generate a lot less trips. So that's also why we were asking the staff what sorts of projects they were expecting in the future so that we can characterize them correctly. And as Aaron said, besides the question of what the land use categories we should use, each one of those land use categories does have a different trip generation profile in terms of time of day and day of week. And so all that needs to be put into the analysis.
And the streetlight technology will help with that?
Oh, it absolutely will. The great thing about streetlight, what it gives us that we don't have before is it gives us all the kinds of trips. So what I showed before, that census data, great for work trips, doesn't tell us anything about all the other trips people make in a day. And so streetlight will help us with that. It also is very comprehensive in terms of time of day and day of week and seasonality, if that's an issue. So it will tell us, for example, where the trips on a Friday evening going up I-80 where they're coming from, where they're going to, how many of them are locally generated, how many of them are through trips. It'll just give us a wealth of data that will really make both the model both more useful for the Nexus study and for your planning stuff, but also for general traffic engineering purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me ask those questions.
All right, any other questions from board members? Seeing none, is there anyone from the public?
Mr. Chair, there's no public comment at this time.
All righty, thank you. Well, this is just an information item, not an action item, so appreciate the update. And without any further ado, we'll move on to the next item. Item H, fiscal year 2020-21 administrative budget amendment number 1. Mr. Luke McNeil-Caird.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the SPRTA Tier 1 fee program, which includes $3 million for the administrative budget, and that was anticipated to be implemented over a 20-year period. So we're up on that 20 years, but luckily we haven't spent all the money. I think that's a testament to how efficient SPRTA is. And so at the June 2020 meeting, the board did approve the 2020-21 budget of approximately $250,000. And in attachment 1, you'll see there's an amendment to that budget. As you just heard from our consultants, they're on an aggressive schedule. And so it's not actually increasing their contract amount. It's just moving more from next fiscal year or this fiscal year to next fiscal year. And then the other thing is the budget also includes, which we've talked about a lot, is the smartphone travel data. And that's at a cost of $116,000. And it'll occur over a 12-month period starting February 1st, 2020. And also the streetlight data to Councilmember Helderschelt's questions, it will be useful not only for the travel demand model, but also for the funding strategy and some of the other projects PCTPA is working on. The amended total budget is $394,000 approximately, and the SPRTA Technical Advisory Committee has concurred with this item, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes. Anyone have any questions regarding this item?
Yeah, just for clarification, Luke, you said February 2020. Did you mean February
2021? Wow, I even had that misprint in my my staff memo.
No, that's okay.
Can't be perfect, Bruce.
No,
Good job.
Well, I want to get rid of 2020 as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
Yes, 2021, sorry.
Okay, seeing no other board comments, is there anyone from the public wish to address this item?
Mr. Chair, there's no public comment at this time.
All righty, the board is asked to approve the fiscal year 2020-21 budget amendment number 1 for the administration of the South Placer Regional Transportation Authority and authorize the executive director to negotiate and sign a 1-year agreement with Streetlight Data to provide travel data for the SPRTA travel demand model update for a total cost not to exceed $120,000. Is there a motion?
Broadway motion to approve.
Helderschelt second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Broadway,
Yes.
Holmes,
Yes.
Howard-Schelt,
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
All right, thank you, board. Now we'll move to item I, the executive director's report.
Mr. Chair, I think we covered items during the executive director's report for the PCTPA board earlier, so I have no other items to report.
All right, thank you. Item J, is there any board directions to staff?
Nope.
Hearing none, there are informational items for your perusal. And our next regularly scheduled SPRTA board meeting is February 24th, 2021. And without any objection, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.